One of the interesting things about what's happened in Canada is how we built our LGBT rights movement to a certain extent inspired by the model of the civil rights movement in the United States. And here I'm speaking about the movement for civil rights for African Americans, the civil rights for women, and those kinds of movements for civil rights for other groups really, I think, inspired us. And of course, I come from that generation in the 60s where the impact of people like Dr. King was huge, huge. And it's always surprised me when I go to the United States how, people kind of tiptoe around the relationship between those two struggles in America, when in Canada it was obvious to us that those issues were related. And in our cases that we argued in Canada, we quoted Dr. King, the time is always ripe to do justice. And we quoted American cases like Brown versus Board of Education. And when dealing with civil union and it's so, Canadians love compromise. So, what's wrong with civil union? Isn't it a lovely compromise? And so often when I was faced with that question, the example I would use was Rosa Parks. And I'd say, well, what's wrong with Rosa Parks sitting at the back of the bus? The seats are just the same as they are at the front of the bus. The bus she's going to get to the destination at the same time. Well, what's wrong with it is, why is she being asked to sit at the back of the bus? She's being asked to sit at the back of the bus as a symbol of her inferiority to the people at the front of the bus. And because the people at the front of the bus want to be privileged, that they shouldn't have to be associating with her because they want it to be seen and known that they are her superiors socially. And if that's the motivation, is sending that signal that one group of citizens is inferior and another group is superior, that is a very bad reason for any law. It cannot be justified. So if the only distinction you're trying to achieve is to keep marriage for straight people because they'd like to keep it for themselves, then that ain't any different from what happened with Rosa Parks. And I'll tell you, Canadians have at least as much admiration for Rosa Parks as Americans do. Those stories about underdogs fighting injustice, they just naturally appeal to people. And in Canada, we don't have any problem seeing the analogy between those civil rights struggles that have taken place. And they happened here too. Don't get me wrong, we had racist laws here too. I mean, we had some bad things happen in our country too. But I think that we got past them maybe a little quicker. They weren't as high profile. And you ended up with some really terrific jurisprudence that we were able to rely on about the really important principles of treating all citizens equally. And of course, the Loving case about the freedom to marry. And that case was tremendously important to us as well. It was important because it didn't just speak to the freedom to marry, but if you look at the history of that case, it also spoke to the fact that you can't use religious justifications, the religious views of the majority, to deny people the right to marry the person of their choice. Because if you look at the Court of Appeal decision in Virginia, it was very clear that the judge who was saying that the Lovings could not get married was because that was God's will. That he had put the different races on the different continents, and if it wasn't for man's interference with God's handiwork, you never would have had the horror of miscegenation. Well, how is that different than coming to court and saying, in Christendom, marriage means a man and a woman? It's exactly the same thing.